The field looked like the surface of a dead planet, cracked, gray-brown, split into 1,000 jagged plates that crunched under every step. Except for one patch. Right in the center of the worst part of the farm, a circle of soil the size of a kitchen table stayed dark. Cool, alive, no crack touched it. Nora Whitfield stood at the edge of that patch on a July morning, when the thermometer already read 94 degrees, and she asked herself the same question she'd been asking for 3 weeks. Why is this the only thing still breathing? She didn't know yet that the answer was buried 4 feet beneath her boots, and that finding it would change the way she understood everything her grandfather had ever tried to tell her. Nora was 29 when the farm became hers, not by celebration, by elimination. Her grandfather Walt had passed the winter before, her mother had no interest in farming, and somebody had to decide whether 210 acres in the dry country of eastern Colorado would keep existing or get sold to a grain company that wanted the water rights and nothing else. She said she'd try for 1 season. That was over a year ago now, and she was still trying. The drought hadn't broken since. Rain gauges sat empty for weeks at a time. The wheat came up thin and pale, if it came up at all. By her second full summer running the place, Nora was doing the math on napkins at 11 at night, trying to find a version of the numbers that didn't end with losing the farm. Neighbors were kind about it, mostly, kind in the way people are kind when they've already decided something is finished. That ground's tired, Nora, old Denny Osgood told her at the co-op, not unkindly. Some land just gives out. Nothing wrong with letting it rest. She didn't believe that, exactly, but she didn't have proof against it either. What she had was memory. Her grandfather walked these same rows with a shovel over his shoulder, stopping every so often to crouch and press his palm flat against the dirt, like he was checking a person's pulse. She'd thought it was just a habit of old men who'd farmed too long to trust anything they hadn't touched themselves. The land talks, if you let it, he used to say. Most folks are just in too big a hurry to hear it. She hadn't understood what that meant. At 22, she hadn't wanted to. At 29, staring at a field that was dying in front of her, she wished she'd asked him more questions while she still could. She'd first noticed the patch in early June, walking the back 40 to check a fence line. The rest of the ground was the color of old bone. But near the center of the field, where the land dipped just slightly, there was a circle of soil that looked freshly rained on, even though nothing had fallen in 19 days. She crouched down. The dirt was cool against her fingers. Not damp exactly. Something closer to holding moisture, the way a sponge feels a day after you've wrung it out. At first, she assumed a pipe had cracked somewhere underground. She checked the old irrigation lines on the property map. Nothing ran through that spot. Never had, as far as the records showed, so she started watching it. Not obsessively, she had a farm to save and didn't have time to obsess over one patch of dirt. But most mornings, she'd walk past it, jotting notes in a small notebook she kept in her jacket pocket. The patch stayed damp longest after even a light rain, while the surrounding ground dried within hours. Wild clover and a strange, tough native grass grew there when nothing else would take root nearby. And when she finally dug a shallow test hole with a trowel, the soil underneath was darker and looser than anywhere else on the farm, closer to something out of healthy prairie ground than drought-cracked wheat country. None of it made sense on its own. Together, it made even less. She mentioned it to her Uncle Ray, who farmed 40 minutes south. He shrugged. Some ground's just different, Nora. Old creek bed maybe. I wouldn't read too much into it. But there'd never been a creek there. She'd checked. By August, the doubt had a shape, and the shape was a stack of unpaid invoices on her kitchen table. The bank had called twice. Her mother, gently, had started asking whether it was time to talk to a realtor. Even Ray, who'd never once told her to quit, said it plainly one afternoon, while they stood looking at another failed section of wheat. You're spending hours on a patch of mud, Nora, while the rest of the farm needs you. I know it's interesting, but interest doesn't pay the bank. She didn't have an answer for him. He wasn't wrong. She'd spent whole evenings out there with a flashlight instead of doing the books, and the books weren't getting any better for the neglect. There was a night in late August when she sat on the porch steps with a beer going warm in her hand, looking out at a field she could no longer really see in the dark, and she let herself think, seriously, about selling, about what it would feel like to hand the keys to a company that would strip the topsoil for one more season of profit and never think about it again. She thought about her grandfather's hands on that dirt. The land talks, if you let it. She didn't sell. But she didn't feel brave about the decision. She felt tired, and stubborn, and not entirely sure those were different things. The next morning, she went and got the shovel. She started at the edge of the patch, where the healthy soil met the cracked ground, so she could compare the two as she went down. The first foot came up easy, dry, crumbling, pale as flour, exactly like the rest of the farm. Then, at about 18 inches, the shovel changed sound. Less of a scrape, more of a soft give. The soil turned darker, held together in clumps instead of falling apart into dust. She kept going. At 2 feet, her shovel struck something hard. Not a rock. Too flat. Too regular. She knelt down and cleared the dirt away with her hands, feeling her heart pick up in a way that had nothing to do with the heat. Stone. A working stone, roughly rectangular, fitted alongside another stone just like it. She spent the next hour on her knees, working slower now, brushing instead of digging. A line of flat stones emerged, laid edge to edge in a shallow channel that ran beneath the patch and curved away toward the low end of the field. The smell hit her before she understood what she was looking at. That particular smell of wet earth, mineral and cool. The smell she associated with spring mornings, not the middle of a drought in August. Beneath the stone line, packed in gravel, she found the moisture. Real, unmistakable moisture, collected in a shallow basin lined with more flat stones, fed by a channel that disappeared underground in both directions. She sat back on her heels in the dirt, hands shaking slightly, and said out loud, to no one, "It's a cistern. Not gold, not bones, not anything she could sell. Something better, though she wouldn't fully understand that for a few more days." She called a retired county extension agent named Phil Aguilar, a man her grandfather used to trade seed catalogs with. He drove out the next afternoon, crouched at the edge of her hole for a long time without saying anything, and then started laughing, not unkindly, but with something like relief. "I'll be damned, your granddad built one of these." What Nora had found, Phil explained, wasn't a cistern exactly. It was older and simpler than that. A shallow, stone-lined channel dug along the natural slope of the field, designed to catch what little rain did fall, and funnel it underground instead of letting it run off or evaporate. The channel fed into a small gravel-packed basin, not to store water for pumping, but simply to hold it long enough to soak slowly into the surrounding soil, feeding the roots above for weeks after a rain everyone else had already forgotten. "It's basically a passive infiltration system," Phil said. "No pump, no pipe going anywhere useful, nothing to break. Just stone and gravel and gravity, doing the job so long as nobody paves over it or plows through it. Why here? Why just this one spot?" Phil pointed at the slope of the land, barely perceptible to the eye, but obvious once he traced it with his hand. "Water runs downhill even when you can't see it running. Whoever built this understood exactly where this field wanted to send its water. They just gave it somewhere to go, instead of letting it wash off or bake out." Nora thought of her grandfather, decades younger than she'd ever known him, walking this same low point in the field with a level and a shovel, reading the land the way some people read a map. The land talks, if you let it. He hadn't been talking about instinct. He'd been talking about this, a system, something built, deliberately, by people who'd spent lifetimes learning what the ground wanted to do with water, and who'd left it behind, unmarked, for someone to either find or lose. Nora didn't dig up the whole field looking for more channels, tempting as it was. Instead, she and Phil mapped what they could of the existing system, enough to see it had likely run in a shallow network across a good third of the property before decades of deep plowing had crushed and buried most of it. She started small. She hired a local excavation crew for 2 days to carefully expose and clean the section she'd found, then extended it, following the same slope, using the same principle: stone, gravel, a shallow channel that let rain sink instead of run. It wasn't glamorous work, it was slow, physical, and expensive, in a season when she had very little to spare. More than once she wondered if she was pouring money into a hole in the ground, literally, for a payoff that might never come. But she'd learned something in that first patch of dirt that she hadn't fully understood before. The farm had never stopped trying to hold on to water. It had just been fighting alone, without the system that used to help it. The following spring brought rain. Not much, but more than the drought had allowed in years. And for the first time since Nora had taken over the farm, the water didn't just puddle and vanish within the day. It sank in. It stayed. The section of field near the restored channel greened up first and held longer between waterings than anywhere else on the property. It wasn't a miracle. The wheat there wasn't spectacular. But it was steady, and steady was more than the farm had managed in 2 years. Denny Osgood drove past one morning in early June and pulled his truck over at the fence line, squinting at the green strip running through an otherwise struggling field. "What'd you do out there?" "Listened," Nora said, and left it at that. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. She understood, better than anyone watching from the road, that she hadn't beaten the drought or outsmarted the land. She'd found something someone else had understood, long before her, and given it a chance to work again. Late that summer, Nora stood at the edge of the original patch, the one that had never dried, the one that started all of it, and pressed her palm flat against the soil, the same way she remembered her grandfather doing it, all those years ago, when she hadn't understood what he was checking for. She understood now. The land had never been dead. It had been waiting, quietly, for someone to stop trying to force it and start listening to what it had already been trying to tell her, through one small circle of dark, cool earth that refused, against all odds, to give up. Maybe the land was never truly finished. Maybe we just stop listening long before it does. If this story pulled you in, you know what to do. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one from the Farmland Files. Drop a like, and send this to someone who loves the land, history, or a good real story well told. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And we'd love to know, what part of this story stuck with you the most? The patch that wouldn't dry, the stones beneath it, or the moment Nora finally understood what her grandfather had been trying to teach her? Everyone seems to walk away from this one with something different, and we genuinely want to hear yours. Until the next story, remember, every field has a story. Sometimes, you just have to look beneath the surface.